nationalism that comes from the background. In 2019, me and my comrade Bruce Hobson realized, and we're part of a group called Liberation Road, we were looking for an international solidarity project. And we realized that as close as Mexico is to the United States, in fact, it overlaps. It doesn't just have a border, it overlaps because of the annexation. So, you know, almost a third of the United States really should belong to Mexico if it hadn't been for that illegal invasion in 1840, what was it, 3, 5, something like that. Yeah, I think the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was 1845. Anyway, you know, why?
1846 to 1848.
Thank you. You know, why is it that we know so little? I mean, like in school, did we learn anything about Mexico or about Chicano history in the United States? No. I think it's partly that the history is really quite shameful, that the United States really did Mexico wrong, and continues to do so, continues to dominate, and to treat the people who were originally here before the folks from England came, to treat them as lesser than the white Americans. So anyway, just to say that we felt like it was really important, especially with the election of a progressive for the first time in forever, to bring real news about what's going on in Mexico to the United States so that the two peoples could join together and create a better, more progressive governments in both countries. We have a lot to learn from Mexico. Don't we wish we were Mexicans now?
So to begin, I think we need some context on.
Elena, your microphone might not be on.
Oh, okay. Is it on? Okay. Can you hear me?
I don't hear you.
Okay. They can't hear me.
It's very, very, very low. We can't hear you here on the Zoom.
I'll speak up here. Oh, pull it off here. Okay. Okay, is this better?
A little bit.
Is that better? I don't think
A little bit, Elena.
Sounds really loud to me, but not to them. Okay.
It's very difficult to hear you on the Zoom.
We could hear you better before, but maybe why don't we just go right into Jose's presentation?
Can you hear this microphone? Can you hear this microphone?
That's true. That's a little soft too.
A little soft too? Okay. Cool.
For some reason, we could hear her very well before. Elena, do you want us to just jump right in?
Sure.
Yeah, let's just jump right in because you all are waiting to hear why there was such a great electoral outcome in Mexico.
Okay. But
So,
give a little
Jose,
bit of
why
the
don't you
history.
take it away?
Yeah, give a little bit of the history of how long that took.
Okay. I'll do my best here. Maybe write in the chat if there's something that needs my attention. I promise I won't take too long. I'll give actually, you know what would be good? I am getting a bit of an echo, so maybe we can mute because it's very distracting. Sorry. There we go. I think that should fix it. Okay, I think we're good. That's how it always begins, right? Okay. So actually, Meizhu, that's exactly how I wanted to start this presentation tonight, is that I wanted to share with you that I've been pleasantly surprised to see a lot of voices, certainly at least on social media, finally asking questions about why did Mexico have such a different result to what happened in the United States. And I'm really glad that those questions are being asked, because part of the mission of the Mexico Solidarity Project, the media work they've been doing, the podcast, has been precisely that, to provoke those kinds of questions to be asked so that there can be a closer relationship between people who have similar dreams and aspirations of a peaceful, democratic transition using the existing levers of power, which I think Mexico has a lot of lessons for the United States in particular to teach. I think I'm speaking to an enlightened crowd here. So in that case, I think you wouldn't be surprised to learn. Oops. We wouldn't be surprised to learn that oftentimes what's happening in Mexico isn't treated as if something worth paying attention to, something where lessons can be drawn, that people can take away experiences and apply them to their own political reality. And I say that because I think it was really quite interesting to see, for example, the reaction amongst certain circles to the new National Front or Popular Front, correct myself, the new Popular Front in France, or even the result of the Labour Party of being elected government in the UK. There was far more noise and excitement and attention being paid to these developments that were happening in a place that's actually much, much further away. I understand that maybe historically and politically there's a certain closeness to what's happening in places like Europe, Australia, and there's not really the time or place to get into it. But I did find it surprising that Mexico, being so close and having such a similar experience, did not generate the same enthusiasm, but now it is. I think, and we'll probably agree, that maybe it's a little bit too late in this instance, but nonetheless, there's still a lot of work ahead, regardless of what would have happened last Tuesday in the United States. And so in any case, I think it's important that even if it is a little bit too late for this election cycle, that people be paying attention. So why do I say people should pay attention to Mexico? Well, I think if you consider that in many ways, our political systems are similar. It's a federal republic made up of states. The actual constitutional name of Mexico is Los Estados Unidos Mexicanos, obviously, but mostly referred to as Mexico, with, for a very long time, a two-party system that largely dominated politics, a deeply entrenched and powerful national bourgeoisie that was very active in any effort to undermine the existing political system. Obviously, there's a mountain of differences as well, but I'm highlighting the similarities because, I did a speaking tour that was organized with the Mexico Solidarity Project. And on that speaking tour, which was about a year ago now, one of the things that I always emphasized at the end was that if we were able to do in Mexico what we accomplished, then I do think that there's plenty of room for optimism when it comes to the United States. In fact, in some ways, because of precisely those differences that exist in Mexico, the challenge was harder. So very quickly, I know, again, I'm assuming that many of you are already familiar, and I saw the Morena merchandise from the campaign there, so you're probably familiar with some activists, but very briefly, I'll give a recap, right? Mexican politics changed in 2018 with the election of López Obrador. One of the terms I always use is that was a watershed moment. It very much represented the end of the neoliberal regime as we understood it in Mexico. And when I speak about the neoliberal regime, oftentimes, if you read the New York Times, they'll call it Mexico's democratic transition period, which is basically the end of the virtual one-party rule by the Institutional Revolutionary Party, which had dominated Mexican politics for 7 years, with the election of the PAN in the year 2000. So finally, an opposition party wins. And this moment was kind of deliberately sold to the world as Mexico's democratic opening, its democratic moment, and things like that. The problem is I think, in particular, that period deliberately tried to confuse this democratic change, that the facilitation of nominally competitive elections, independent agencies, all the rest of it, that kind of comes with this so-called democratic, with neoliberalism, with capitalism, with the perpetuation of the extractivist model here in Mexico, the suppression of wages, the export of primary goods, although some finished products and things like that later on after NAFTA. But basically, this so-called democratic transition period, in its efforts to try to confuse the two, terms, democracy and neoliberal capitalism, made a lot of critical mistakes in terms of its resonance amongst the population, who never felt like this democratic transition actually represented anything to them, right? And, likely some of you are probably thinking that's somewhat similar to what happened in this last election cycle in the United States, where, the Democrats ran on this is, we must save democracy and all this kind of stuff. That was very similar to the campaign that the opposition ran against Claudia Sheinbaum in this most recent election, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I apologize. All that to say that, so 2018, López Obrador is elected, and López Obrador victory, like I said, is a watershed moment because he comes from, not an establishment party, right? So we have what is an upstart party that was founded as a political party only in 2014, but it actually had some time that predates it as a movement, and then suddenly wins the presidency in a landslide election. I mean, winning an overwhelming mandate. Really, really historical, because while there were certainly presidents in Mexico's past that had secured really large victories, this was during a period where it couldn't be said that it was a free and fair election. So really, this was the largest, strongest mandate, and a lot of it is the product of that. López Obrador promised to break with the existing established neoliberal order that predominated the country since basically the year 2000, as I was explaining. And there's a lot more history there in terms of who the figure of López Obrador is. And unfortunately, it's probably not a lot of time to get into it in this session, but suffice it to say, he is, I always say he's a political animal. He's very, very smart in terms of using the existing structures to be able to advance this political project, which ultimately came to be understood, came to be known as the fourth transformation of Mexico. And what does that mean in very kind of casual terms? And I apologize for talking so fast because I'm just trying to get a lot of information out there. So it's a shift away from a lot of the orthodoxy, especially when it comes to political economy, that neoliberalism, the Washington Consensus, sought to put on Mexico. And so instead of like means-tested programs, what López Obrador's government did was universal, constitutionally protected social programs that largely consisted of cash transfers, the most famous one being the universal pension for seniors, but also other ones for people with disabilities. There was also an expansion of scholarships for students. There was the investment in the countryside, a program called Sembrando Vida, which aimed to pay people to stay in their communities and plant trees. Anyway, the point is that if I had to sum it up, it's kind of, the fourth transformation of Mexico involved a kind of a reorientation of the state. There's a slogan that López Obrador uses, I think a lot of really kind of captured it, which is por el bien de todos, primero los pobres, or for the good of everybody, the poor come first, and putting them at the very forefront. And I think also worth mentioning is also the emphasis on the state-owned utilities, state-owned enterprises being an active player in the economy. Under the previous neoliberal regime, there was a privatization effort, widespread privatization, and in the 80s and 90s into the 2000s. But this López Obrador representing an investment in the state-owned company, Pemex, the rescue of the electricity industry, sort of that direct intervention of the state, which was something that, runs contrary to neoliberal orthodoxy. And of course, I think one worth mentioning is also kind of the intangibles, right? He tapped into a mood in Mexico of people who felt underrepresented, who felt ignored, who had been excluded by the so-called, democratic transition here in this country. And I think really, really consolidated the working class under the leadership of Morena, which is something that is quite monumental, and I think is also really quite has major implications for the future of political work, political organizing here in Mexico. Okay, so that catches up kind of to the moment, and the one thing that I wanted to talk about tonight, and I'm sure we'll have questions about it, which is just what happened this year in the elections. So presidents here in Mexico are constitutionally limited from running more than one term. So he stepped down, and the party had an internal process to select its candidate. And ultimately, the candidate was selected as the woman who's president today, Claudia Sheinbaum, who in many, many ways is a protege of López Obrador, having jumped into politics under his leadership when he was the governor of Mexico City. But obviously a woman with a long list of accomplishments in her own right, a winner of the Nobel Prize. She was part of the IPCC, the UN group that was providing recommendations around climate change. Obviously, her political trajectory, leading one of the largest cities in the world, a very complex political space to navigate. But also, received her doctorate. She's an engineer. She's an environmentalist. So quite an extraordinary candidate. And I think also ideologically, one thing I used to always say in the presentations, ideologically, she represented the left of Morena in a lot of ways. she was the candidate that was seen as someone who was proposing not just the status quo and kind of keeping the good things that López Obrador did, but actually represented a deepening. The language she used and continues to use is building the second floor of Mexico's fourth transformation. And I think that is important because in these transition periods, right, often there is it's almost treated as like a common sense thing that there should be a pivot to the center, that you should try to win over that middle class, orient your campaign and your strategy towards that, when they clearly went with, no, we're going to go with the strategy of emphasizing everything we've done, what sets us apart from the opposition, and that we intend to deepen to go further with the transformation. And that was the option that was the one selected. And obviously we know the result. She wins an extraordinary mandate, even bigger than López Obrador. And I think that can't be overstated. I think there was a lot of people who had the expectation that it would be a difficult transition because López Obrador is a very genuinely charismatic individual. He had been in politics for most of his entire adult life. He's somebody who had been campaigning in many, many elections. So he's very, very familiar to the population. There was a concern with that kind of transfer. And it most certainly did. Not only did it, but I think because of the heightened political consciousness that we can safely say now exists in Mexico, there was a very clear understanding that Claudia Sheinbaum comes from the same movement. This movement is defending these things, and we're going to support her. And actually wins, I'm just looking up the number here, almost 36 million votes, or nearly 60% of the vote. Now, Mexico doesn't have 2 rounds of elections, but even if they did, right, she won more than 50% in this election. And just an extraordinary, a strengthened mandate. And the key thing about that mandate is that it was delivered on the back of a commitment to continue the transformation. And one of the ways that has concretely expressed itself, and it's probably what you're most familiar with, and this will be the last thing I mention here, is the judicial reform. So in Mexico, like I was talking about the fourth transformation of Mexico, using the levers of the state to peacefully win control of the federal government and engage in a peaceful transformation of that. I mean, there's still a lot of barriers. So, again, I'm speaking to a room that is likely familiar with this, but, winning elections isn't winning power. And there are still a lot of what we call conservative strongholds, these kind of bulwarks, deeply built into this. It's part of one of the features of neoliberalism. It kind of sounds like I'm talking about something like a deep state, which is not really a terminology I use, but in some ways it's similar to that. This idea that there are very well-entrenched interests that are inside of independent agencies, in the media, and in the courts. And so part of what López Obrador, the fourth transformation, Morena, and now Claudia Sheinbaum has successfully done is picking your fights, right? Knowing, hey, we have to go after these strategic areas in order to break down those conservative strongholds, those barriers to the deepening of this process, for it to go further, to be able to continue to, pursue their ideology. And, in the case of Mexico, there was a pretty significant one, which is the electoral authority, which, became a political actor. It's supposed to be the referee, but it's like the referee is, can I make a football analogy here? I think I'm speaking to plenty of people, right? It's kind of like the referees when the Chiefs are playing, right? That's always kind of tilted in their favor. Apologies if there's any Chiefs fans. But anyway, I make that kind of some levity of it. But the point is that there are very powerful interests that use, like quite literally, one of the kind of biggest opponents of Mexico's fourth transformation is an oligarch by the name of Ricardo Salinas Pliego. Salinas Pliego owns a TV station, and every time he has kind of a beef with the government, he sends his lapdogs on his TV channel to, invent things to criticize the government on it. At one point, there was some kind of disagreement in the previous government, and they started, sounding the alarm about the communist textbooks and how the education secretariat was distributing these communist materials to people's children and things like that. It's kind of like, fear-mongering, Red Scare kind of stuff. But people didn't fall for it, right? Anyway, all that to say is that these conservative strongholds, and one of the key ones that very much played a very deliberate protagonist role in the last government with López Obrador was the Supreme Court. and the courts more generally, but quite literally, turning back laws. Oh, you didn't debate this long enough, and so you have this law doesn't pass. Or, there was an effort I talked about the rescue of the state electricity utility. They actually passed laws around the renationalization of the energy generation industry, basically bringing it under public control again. And they said, well, this goes contrary to competitiveness, which is something that, the law demands that Mexico, practice competitiveness. And you can see that's a really good example of the way that they kind of implant these, neoliberal ideologies into the state and its various functions. And so the duty of the people seeking the transformation is to break those down. And I think if you understand it in those terms, that's what's actually happening with the judicial reform. You had a very, very conservative institution, although it is, its mission is to protect human rights and to defend the Constitution. It, like the Electoral Authority, became a political actor. This was made most obvious to everybody who's paying attention to Mexican politics just last week. And obviously, I forgive everybody for not seeing it because it was Tuesday. Tuesday was a big day here in Mexico. And obviously, there was big things happening in the United States then as well. So on Tuesday, the Supreme Court, so we're talking about a little less than a week ago, debated whether or not it had the authority to overturn a constitutional amendment. In Mexico, the Constitution can be amended with a supermajority in the Congress and with a majority of the local Congresses agreeing to it. The Constitution has been amended hundreds of times since 1917. This is normal. It is very common. And in fact, during the neoliberal period, there was a lot of constitutional amendments that rolled back some of the more progressive features of the Mexican Constitution, which I remind people, if you're not familiar, was born out of a revolutionary struggle. That was born out of the Mexican Revolution. And so the court was considering, for the first time ever, to give itself the authority to intervene and actually roll back on the constitutional reform. It's basically saying, nope, we have to hit the undo button, which of course is absurd. Morena campaigned on a promise to reform the judicial branch, asked voters to get a supermajority, was given that supermajority, and then wielded that supermajority. And it's interesting because if you read most of the mainstream media coverage, they say that Morena, Claudia Sheinbaum, López Obrador before her are a bunch of authoritarians when they're the Democrats. They're the ones who are playing by the rules. And then it's the other side that's trying to change the rules after the fact. Anyway, so the Supreme Court is debating this. And in fact, they realize that one of the actual conservative ministers of the court decides that he's going to be consistent. He's like, well, in the past, I always voted that we didn't have the right to intervene in the Constitution, that this is not the place, that we don't have the faculty to do it, so I'm not going to do it. And so they lack the votes to be able to do it. And incredibly, at one point, the president of the Supreme Court, Norma Piña, who's kind of been leading this exercise to try to stop the government from implementing this reform, tried to change the rules again on the spot, saying, actually, we don't need 8 votes, we only need 6. And then called a suspension of the session to, I guess, engage in lobbying and try to get them to agree that only 6 votes were necessary. Ultimately, they didn't. It was a step too far. I think they didn't feel like they had the confidence. I think they were worried about the backlash it would provoke. But hablando de this, that's a victory, right? That was a coup attempt. It was the effort to use these conservative bulwarks, these conservative strongholds, these efforts to subvert the democratic will, right? There's been a monumental advance in terms of the political education of Mexico, of the population. They voted for a project. They defend that project. I didn't have a chance to talk about this, right? But one of my favorite moments in López Obrador's government was when actually during when there was heightened language in the mainstream media with people in the United States, politicians talking about unilateral military action and this and that. On the occasion of the day that Mexico's oil industry was expropriated, he calls for a demonstration here in the capital, and 500,000 people turned out. And I know that sounds like an extraordinary number, but it's true. I was in the streets. It was rivers and rivers of people accompanying the president. And so you have a population that is also politically engaged, that is now increasingly more conscious of the class struggle and the way that it fits into this, of a reorganization of the working class under the leadership of Morena, of a defense of sovereignty, and a strategic vision, right? Like when you win a supermajority, you use it, and you use it against your adversaries in order to continue with that process. And I think so far what we've seen is a correct strategy that has not only delivered results, right? People being lifted out of poverty to numbers that had never seen before in Mexico. Extraordinary accomplishment in that sense, but also, right, that is politically very quite astute, right? That is making the right moves, making the right decisions, not backing down from the fight that they know that they can win, and not being afraid to tap into mass mobilization to say, you know what? And there was talk there, like what would have happened if the Supreme Court had tried to do that, right? There would have been a very large kind of mobilization, I think, to kind of pressure the Supreme Court to back down. The government talked about having a plan B. I'm not sure what it was. They're not going to need it, but historically there has been that willingness to say, the streets belong to us, the majority is with us, and we're going to use that majority to benefit that very same majority. And I think, again, to conclude, there's a lot of lessons for Mexico, for the United States from Mexico. I'm really glad that people are asking that decision. I've seen a lot of conversations around, I think the terminology most commonly used in the United States is economic populism, right? Of actually catering your policies to the working class, of mobilizing them on that basis, but also attending to progressive social issues as well, right? Again, I didn't have a chance to talk about that, but we've seen a lot of advancements around reproductive rights, around the rights of trans people, et cetera, et cetera. So they're moving forward in that regard as well. I think it's, again, very useful to pay attention to Mexico, and I think have a running attention to it. Obviously, with the election of Trump, there are a lot of challenges, although I'm not as scared as some people are. I think some people are deliberately trying to overplay the risk that Trump represents to the bilateral relationship. Mexico has obviously a very important economic relationship with the United States. It's often kind of portrayed as if it's one directional, that we benefit from being the United States neighbor, and we certainly do. But I think we should be clear about this as well, that these are deeply integrated economies. Mexico became the #1 trading partner of the United States. All that to say is that the United States needs Mexico as much as Mexico needs the US. And this idea that they can just kind of blow up the bilateral commercial relationship in particular, I don't think is really all of that of a realistic thing that's going to happen. It's too important and would have too far-reaching consequences. But there are dangers, right? I think Trump is serious when he talks about unilateral military action, which could include boots on the ground. But even if it is drone strikes in Mexico, that's a horrible prospect, a huge violation of sovereignty, would have very serious consequences. But anyway, instead of focusing on the negative, I do want to focus on the positive, right? I'm glad that we're having this meeting, we're having these kinds of conversations, and that hopefully we can be closer, because I do think that there's still a long way to go. People asking the right questions, but people need to actually build further links between what's happening here in Mexico with what's happening in the United States, and have a long-running relationship. Because obviously, as working class people, we have far more in common than we do in differences, despite being on different sides of the border. And I invite you to support the work of the Mexico Solidarity Project, the Bulletin, the podcast, everywhere that we're trying to get information to you so that you can keep in touch with Mexico. All right. Thank you. Sorry I went a little bit long there, but I'm more than happy to address questions as well. Meizhu, take it away.
Let me just add a couple of quick things. One about the judiciary. So many of you are labor supporters, and you probably saw the members of the judicial branch demonstrating the Zocalo, large numbers of people. Well, why were they so upset? It turns out, by the Supreme Court's own numbers, that 50% of the judicial staff are family members and friends of justices. So their jobs were at stake because they are basically patronage appointments. And secondly, in terms of money, there's a rule that nobody should make more than the president. The Supreme Court justices made more and had generous benefit packages as well in terms of the money they had for staff and et cetera, et cetera. So there was definitely a financial interest. And, they're eligible to run, but they don't want to run because they know how unpopular they are. They know that they would not get elected. So that's part of it. The other thing I would just mention is that one of the reasons that Morena continued to be successful is political education. And I think for those of us on the left, we know how important that is. It's not just that you want the population to support you because you have given them a social benefit. You want them to understand the philosophy, the politics behind that. And AMLO, every day of his 6 years, had what he called a press conference. But to me, it was almost like a political education session where he would take questions, but he would really explain. He explained what neoliberalism was. He explained why there was corruption. He was explaining why the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. And he was explaining why he was prioritizing the poor and the effect it was having. So I think that is a huge lesson. Of course, in this country, the Democrats can't do that because they are neoliberals, just as the Republicans are. So it's going to take us on the left to do that kind of political education. So let me just say, does anybody have any questions?
I do. I have a very important question. I think it's really great. You know, it's almost a miracle what happened in Mexico, where the left actually won and defeated the neoliberals. And how can that happen in the U.S.? Because we have fascists on the Democrats, with fascists on the Republicans. And how can we get the Greens to win? Please tell us how that can happen.
I think if we had the answer to that, I'd be a very well-paid consultant, and I get some of that $1 billion the Democrats. No, I try not to say or give any prescriptions to what you should or should not do in the United States. You know, that I don't think that's my place. But I will say that I think you know, a very serious analysis of the Mexico story in terms of, you know, how we were able to do it here, I think would be a worthwhile exercise, and sort of kind of very quickly, I guess, in terms of what was done correctly. I know that this is a very contentious thing, which is like, do you work with the Democratic Party? Do you try to build something outside of that? Again, I'm not here to tell people what to do, but I will say that in Mexico, there was a left-wing party. There was the Institutional Revolutionary Party, which was center-right. There was the National Action Party, which is right-wing. And then there was a breakaway in the 80s following a fraud that led to the creation of a party called the PRD, the Party of the Democratic Revolution. And that was the vehicle for the left in Mexico until it wasn't, right? Until it became consumed by the establishment. And it became very much a neoliberal party as well. And there came a moment where the Mexican population, those people who were interested in the parliamentary struggle, said, we have to create a different vehicle, right? We have to found something else, something that won't fall into those same traps. And that's when Morena was born as a movement and then became eventually a political party. So I think if there's a lesson there, it's to understand when it is appropriate to stay with the existing vehicles and when is it appropriate to make a break. When does it make more sense and will be more successful to create a different kind of vehicle, and what were the conditions behind that, right? Like Morena wasn't born out of nothing. You know, charismatic leadership matters, right? That's something that I think is worth considering. The role of somebody like López Obrador with his trajectory and his history and his resonance with the population, but also the very hard work of party building, right? To found a party in Mexico, you have to have state level assemblies, you have to have thousands of signatures, you have to go through the whole process of, you know, registering before the electoral authorities. Like, that was really hard work that was done by volunteers, by people who believed in the project and did sort of the pounding the pavement work, the trabajo de hormiga, we call it in Spanish, of, you know, wearing out the soles of your shoes to build a new party, and actually, you know, understanding that this is what's necessary in the moment and doing everything you can to raise the profile of that party, and whatever conditions are present, because there are difficult circumstances here in Mexico to do political work, certainly in some areas that are outright deadly circumstances, and then you know, kind of translating that to the U.S. experience. What does that look like? And, you know, this is a good time to ask those questions, precisely because I think everybody is asking themselves those questions. What do we do in the present circumstances?
So Austin, let me answer that as well. During this last election, there were a number of groups who wanted to pursue what was called the inside-outside strategy. So you work both within the Democratic Party to try to influence it, but you also work outside of it. In other words, you have to build an independent base in order to make a difference. And you have to have enough strength to actually have the Democratic Party need to answer to you. So in many states, people have built independent political organizations. They're called IPOs. And that is, I think one of the best examples is the Working Families Party, which began in New York. So they'll endorse a Democrat if the Democrat is decent, but if not, they might run their own candidates. So it's definitely like inside and outside. And they have enough of a base so that the Democrats want their endorsement, and that encourages them to move a bit to the left. The other thing is, in this election, we had a strategy called block broaden and build. So the block part of it is that the most important thing many of us felt was to block fascism in this country, and therefore you work in a united front with the Democratic Party. And I think the thing about that is because it was a presidential election, the centrist Democrats definitely were in the lead of that united front. But now that they have failed so miserably, there is an opportunity for leftist forces, both within and outside of the Democratic Party, to try to start to lead that coalition in a more progressive direction. Broaden in terms of that, we need to broaden the number of allies that we have. And we can sometimes be too narrow and fight among ourselves. We have to be really careful. A coalition is never a comfortable place because you're working with people who disagree with you on a number of issues, but we have to get more comfortable with working with folks that don't agree with us on every issue. So that's the broaden part. And the last part is build. We need to really strengthen the left core of what we hope will develop into a new party and into a new majority that can actually rule this country at some point.
Can I be
Elena?
heard here? Yeah, I was,
Austin, did you want to?
can you hear me?
I thank you for your answer. I myself actually see the Democratic Party as the greater of the two evil in this election, insofar as they are warmongers. Trump, in comparison, is actually a peacenik, which is outrageous to say, but it's true. And I think in the future, we need to work. I mean, take Tulsi Gabbard, for instance. I don't agree with at all her movement toward the Republican Party. She should have moved to the Green Party, but she was a practitioner. She thought that the only way to get peace in the world is through the Republican Party. We have a fascist Democratic Party in the United States. We need to get the Green Party elected, and I think that's the only way to go. We can't actually remotely hope to win anything through the Democratic Party of slavery, which is run slavery for over 150 years.
So I want to pivot, if it's okay with you, Elena, to what this new president is going to mean for Mexico, and then also maybe for Mexicanos within the United States. So I wanted to start with the war on drugs. The war on drugs actually started in the 1970s under President Nixon. And one of his advisors said that one of the rationales for the war on drugs is that it was actually a political thing. It wasn't to stop people from using drugs, but that he had two main enemies within the United States. One was the rising left at that time. Some of you may remember the 60s and 70s, and if you do, there was a lot of left ferment. We were all reading Marx for one thing, and there was just a lot of organizing going on. And the other was the civil rights movement and African Americans. So those were his two main enemies. The war on drugs was perfect because he could arrest white progressives, hippies or whatever, who were doing marijuana. And we probably all remember those days. Everybody was smoking all the time. You'd go to a theater and a joint would be passed around, which was a nice collective experience. But also for African Americans too, just coming down hard on them for their drug use, different kinds of drugs and more severe penalties for the use of drugs other than marijuana. So that just increased because over time it got worse and worse. So under Bush in 2006, they brought Mexico into it, and that was called the Merida Initiative, where the use of punishment and actually militarized violence to stop the drug trade was put in place. So I think under Biden-Harris, there was beginning to be a move to work with Claudia Sheinbaum to use a different perspective, not a war on drugs, but a more public health perspective. And that's what Mexico has been advocating, that we have to see the use of drugs as a health issue, not as a criminal justice issue. And so I think that under Trump, though, he is much more, he loves military means, he loves violence, and I think we're going to see the militarization in terms of the war on drugs increase. As Jose mentioned, he promised to invade Mexico in order to take out the drug kingpins. when it's pretty well known in both countries that that is a failed strategy. In the past, the US gave Mexico millions of dollars of worth of arms, and those arms made their way actually into the hands of the cartels. And so we saw the result of the war on drugs to be many more people addicted in the United States and many more people dead in both places, one from drug overdose in the US and the other from the use of guns and violence in Mexico. So that's one thing that we will have to watch out for and be ready to stop. The other thing is trade. So tariffs, he's already said that he's going to put 100% tariffs on cars, Chinese cars that are made in Mexico or whatever. So that could also affect the Mexican economy. The last USMCA, which was negotiated under Trump, but because of the advocacy of the AFL-CIO and the insistence of Democrats, there was a labor labor protections that were put into it. There's a mechanism called the Rapid Response Mechanism, where people who are working in Mexico can petition the U.S. Labor Department and the U.S. Trade Representative to intervene if they feel that their right to organize is being violated. And that has been used successfully a number of times. I don't know that we will see that again under Trump. We may, but we don't know yet what was going to happen there. And then the other issue is migration, and that's the one where Trump has really promised to come down hard on immigrants in the United States. Not that they weren't being deported. I mean, we know that Obama deported more people than any other president before him. So, and that's probably why many immigrants voted for Trump. They felt like, either way, they were going to be deported and so on. So migration, though, I think it will be further militarized and like, will he actually do he love I mean, I'm going to keep going back to that. He's a bully and he likes to use bully tactics, violent tactics in order to get his way. So I guess I would just say that one of the things that we need to do too is to rebuild Black-Brown unity, which we did have in earlier days, but it has kind of broken down. Um, and that's regardless of who is in power. We need to strengthen the support for immigrants in the Black community. We have to strengthen the support for repression of African Americans in the immigrant community. And there is certainly plenty of common ground between those groups. So I think that, our work going forward is to, again, our message is unity among all of those who are oppressed, and we need to stop the division among us. I actually was talking to a Latino activist, and I asked, well, aren't you upset by Trump calling Mexican immigrants rapists and criminals? And he said, well, that was in 2016. He seems to have eased off. Now he's picking on the Haitians. And so he wasn't as bothered. And I'm thinking, like, when do we learn that, an injury to one is an injury to all, as we say in the labor movement? If he's picking on Haitians, that's not good either. And so, yeah, just again, I think that our task is really to build as much unity as we can. Any other thoughts that other people may have, other experiences that you've had?
I have a question. Wouldn't it be great if these Republicans who kind of are going to run the government in the future? Wouldn't it be great if they asked for reparations for the the ex-slaves or just Afro-Americans in general? Like
Hey,
scholarships
Austin,
Can I
will
be
you
heard?
please let other people speak?
and yeah, and made the Democratic Party pay for it all.
Yeah, no, the reparations is a great issue, and yeah, let's see if there's anyone else that would like to speak to. Thanks, Austin. I'm sure you've had plenty of thoughts since last Tuesday. Spill
Can
it.
you can you explain the nature or the attitudes of the military in Mexico and if they are loyal, so-called loyal to the democratic process, bourgeois democratic process, or are you concerned, or is Morena concerned that they could intervene to suppress things? Thank you.
Sure, I think that's a great question because often militarization, it's a term I don't like particularly using it because I think it can mean a lot of things. But one of the times it's used is basically to say, oh, López Obrador is an authoritarian, Morena, the Fourth Transformation, and now Claudia, they're all authoritarians. You know, they're militarizing society. And the issue of the military is a curious one. I think I'll start with a criticism. López Obrador was elected on a promise to clear up what happened with the forcible disappearance of the 43 students. Ultimately, not a lot of information, new information came to light as a result of the López Obrador government establishing a truth commission. Some new things, but the parents maintain that they have been disappointed with the lack of information and transparency. That lack of transparency is coming as a result of the pressure from the armed forces in Mexico. I say that because it speaks to just how powerful they are. The armed forces play a very, very large role in the national political life here in Mexico. A lot of it because of the ongoing security situation in the country, which is undeniable. We obviously understand that in Mexico, there are very serious issues around safety and organized crime at groups' activities, in particular certain parts of the country. And so, since 2007, basically, 2006, Felipe Calderon sent the armed forces into the streets to so-called engage in a war on the cartels. And that decision is largely why we're in the situation we are still in today in Mexico when it comes to security. But it did give a lot of power to the armed forces. They are very, very powerful. They are very, very well funded, and it's because they're tasked with these security duties and they remain to. I would say that one of the big differences with López Obrador is they actually created a new branch of the armed forces, originally civilian, but now is under the purview of the armed forces, which is the National Guard. And the National Guard is tasked with a wide variety of duties, but one of them is tackling organized crime groups. And so the armed forces do have a lot of influence. But I think also the other part I would say is that the reason you've seen a catering to the interests of the armed forces, I think, is precisely motivated by a certain fear or nervousness around their loyalty. As we know, that the threat of an unconstitutional seizure of power via the armed forces is not exactly something new to Latin America, and it's actually something that's come up frequently in recent history. And I'm not just talking about Chile, but I mean, we had the coup in Bolivia in 2019, the attempted coup there as well later on. And so I think it is a very serious threat, but although, I think the more pressing challenges are coming from things like lawfare and these kinds of efforts to try to use these deeply entrenched structures in Mexican society to impede the agenda. But if you were to ask me to specifically respond to your question, there isn't necessarily that concern right now in this moment. That there could be, an unconstitutional seizure of power by the armed forces. This is very contentious, but I'll put it out there. A lot of times in Mexico, and it's something that López Obrador talked about, which is that es el pueblo uniformado. So a lot of the rank and file of the armed forces and even its leadership actually comes from the lower strata of Mexican society. That's a common feature of most armed forces, I think, in modern times, but it's true of Mexico. And I think there is a narrative that comes from Morena, which says that because they're the people in uniform, they can be trusted. And I do think that is an attitude that is shared quite widely in Mexican society, which generally, if you look at opinion polls, they view the armed forces as the most trustworthy institution. There's a lot of reasons for that, and I'm not particularly inclined to agree. I also, I've done a lot of work around the defense of human rights, and there is a very long and large history of the armed forces violating human rights here in Mexico, and I don't think that should be glossed over. I understand the motivations of the Morena politicians to try to kind of, give this kind of image of the armed forces as the people in uniform. But I think that we should be careful about letting that go too far and absolving them of their responsibilities. Obviously, with the most recent likely role in the forced disappearance of 43 students, but also, I mean, there's too many to list in terms of the violations of human rights that have gone to the Inter-American Commission and the Human Rights Court, et cetera, different spaces where Mexico has been held responsible for violations of human rights committed by the armed forces and other security forces, not just them, police as well. But I will say that I do think one of the things that is seldom mentioned is that part of the reason that the government does try to keep the armed forces happy is because of a fear that there could be a break with the Constitution, right? I'll end on this note. It's worth remembering that in the 70s in Chile, they often talked about, oh, the armed forces have always been loyal in this country. They would never do a coup. And then they did a coup on September 11th, 73. And so, we can't be too comfortable when it comes to them, especially because of the very close relationship that the top of the armed forces has with Washington. These are very well linked. They have a very long history of cooperation and security agreements that I think has obviously had repercussions amongst the leadership, the way that they think their military doctrine, right? Mexico is not Venezuela in that, there was a former member of the armed forces who changed the military doctrine in that country, right? This is still very much one that is deeply wedded to the interests of the United States and its armed forces, although there is increasingly distance between the two.
I would like to just add a couple things, and I don't disagree with Jose in terms of watching and being very vigilant. But when AMLO took office, he knew that the military had been very repressive of the people. And one of the reasons he created the National Guard was he wanted a force that was put in place not to repress the people, but to protect the people. And I have to say that I was riding the train in Mexico in May, and the National Guard are present on all of the platforms of the train. And I saw them smiling and talking with people, helping the elderly off the train, carrying people's suitcases to put them on the train. I'm like, that would never happen in the United States. And then I had mentioned before that you had these demonstrations by the opposition in the Zocalo. Did they use the armed forces against them? No. They have really said people have the right to protest. We protested in the past, and now people who oppose us, they have the right to protest against us. So the military has not been used to repress the people in this current situation. The other thing I would add is that a lot of projects were given to the military, like, for example, building the new oil refinery or building the new train. Why is that? This is really more like the Army Corps of Engineers, which was responsible for building all of the dams during, the post-Depression years. These were public projects, infrastructure building projects, and that was given to the military in the United States as well, and all over the world. Militaries have been involved. Now, in Mexico, because of neoliberalism, a lot of the departments were hollowed out. There really were not engineers in the Department of Transportation who could carry something like this out anymore. So it was really only the military that still had that capacity. And so that's one of the reasons that those huge projects were given to the military to manage and construct. And you know what? The huge train Maya project, it came in under budget and on time. Again, like in the United States, could we imagine a project of that size being done in 6 years? It would take 40 years if it got done at all. And talk about budget overruns, forget it. So the public sector, regardless of it's the military someplace else, can, if they don't contract too much out, they can keep costs under control and keep corruption out if they're not corrupt themselves. And that's the trick. But I think, as Jose said, we do have to watch it, because now for all of those, some very good reasons, even with good reasons, we always have to keep an eye on the military. Yeah, go ahead, Sharon.
Hello.
Well, I don't know where that raise hand thing is. I'm sorry. I couldn't find it, so I had to do it this way. To be honest, I've really not known about what's going on in Mexico for a long time. I took a little bit of a break. And I'm so interested in how this movement got started. Was it this leader who did it? Did he? I mean, it's so amazing what happened. I mean, I wish I knew about it. It's awesome. And what you've described about what's going on in Mexico is so beautiful and wonderful. What happened? Was it youth who did it? How did they? I mean, look how hard Mao worked in the mountains, to get something going. And this is just amazing. So if you know a little bit about how it started, I'd love to hear about that.
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of it was López Obrador. I think it can't be overstated how important it was that his leadership was there and played the role that it did. I don't think a figure aside from him would have been able to do it in this specific way. I think, I've been guilty of romanticizing past revolutionary struggles in Latin America, the Mexican Revolution itself, but the Cuban Revolution and others, right? The guerrilla struggles, the Central American organizations, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a place for it, and I think the mysticism of that is also really important. But I mean, like you said, it's pretty extraordinary what happened here in Mexico. We're talking about, the largest Spanish-speaking country in the world, very, very diverse in every sense of the word in terms of its population and its geography and its cultures. You have mestizo and European influence, but also indigenous cultures, especially in the South and all this kind of stuff. And to take a country like Mexico and to do a wholesale remaking of the state in a peaceful manner, like winning bourgeois elections, I think is really quite extraordinary. I think López Obrador in particular deserves a lot of credit. But the more materialist answer is that, there was a lot of contradictions in Mexico and the existing political establishment that were unsustainable, right? Mexico, particularly in the post-free trade era, so it kind of overlaps with the so-called democratic transition, which is said to have begun in 2000, and obviously free trade began in 94. There was a lot of people who were left out, totally left out. Obviously, a lot of people who benefited, and they ended up playing a predominant role in the making of sort of modern Mexico, 21st century Mexico. But those people who were marginalized and disappeared, they didn't go away, right? They didn't disappear. They were pushed to the sides, but they were still there. And they found a voice in López Obrador that managed to channel their discontent in a way that was politically effective, right? I think that part is really important, is that he understood it. And there were a lot of challenges, right? I mean, 2006 was an election that López Obrador won, but it was stolen from him in a fraud. 2012 was an election that was basically bought by the PRI. And so 2018 comes around. It's interesting because I think if they had let him win in 2006, we wouldn't have seen as a deep transformation as we did in 2018, because they ended up winning a landslide, because he won a majority, his party and its allies won a majority in both houses of Congress. So there was no need to negotiate with the opposition. They were able to kind of prove that they were different in practice by being government, and then build on that by even winning an even bigger majority in Congress, an even bigger mandate, and all this kind of stuff. So how did it begin? I think if this didn't happen, if 2018 didn't happen, something else would have in Mexico. The situation was just unbearable, I think, for the vast majority of the population, of just extraordinarily increasing poverty, increased cost of living, privatization everywhere you look, declining services, all this kind of stuff that even people who maybe identified with the right-wing National Action Party as their political home, in the 2018 election, they went with Morena because they were convinced by the need of something outside of what had already been there before. And I think that really is that. But had that not happened, I mean, I think if López Obrador hadn't won, or if they tried to steal the election or whatever it was, it would have been very, very intense social struggle on the ground. Kind of, it would have been more like what you saw in Chile, a few years ago, of just like mass protests, lots of discontent. But that has to find an expression. In Chile, and then ended up expressing itself in a constituent assembly that failed, right? And Mexico expresses itself in Morena and the Fourth Transformation, which is succeeding, which I think also gives it a lot of room to operate because, you know, it's much easier to convince people when you can point to your record now. And I think that also speaks to just how far they're willing to go. There's still a long way to go. There's a saying that now I'm starting to use, and maybe it's a little bit early because Sheinbaum has only been in office for a month, but she talks about the second floor. So what does the third floor look like, right? Maybe the third floor is socialism. And that's the kind of thing that we're talking about here, some of us anyway.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
That's good. Yeah, I think that, you know, we've had 40 years of neoliberalism, and so people all around the world are searching for an alternative, and sometimes they seem like they're just going from left to right because they're just grasping at straws. Well, something's got to stop this. But the thing is, you know, other people might win, but AMLO actually took it on. He actually did overturn neoliberal policies. He reversed privatization. He re-socialized. You know, he brought things back under public control, and that was significant. Sorry, you've got a question up there, Kevin?
It's a simple question. First, thank you very much for the information that you provided and enlightening us into what's going on in Mexico. My simple question is, could you tell us how many political parties are there in Mexico? And maybe classify them accordingly. And also, the Supreme Court, is it elected or appointed, or how it works? But also, I have a comment on that, on the things that was mentioned, like war on drugs. And I would say that anything comes from the United States in the title of war on something, on drugs, on terrorism, and what have you, is just a tactic and a tool that the United States is using in order to have them a way to intervene in the internal matters of the country that is in the focus, whether it is Mexico or any other countries, and we have that in the Middle East. So it is not easy. I understand that it is not easy for Mexico to be how can I put it, to be in the shadow of the United States, very close to that, and even to deal also with Canada, which is a double jeopardy for Mexico to maneuver against the intervention of the imperialist forces in the world, specifically the United States. Thank you.
So go ahead, Jose. He had a couple of questions.
Sure. Yeah, okay. So I'll do the questions real quick. So in terms of political parties, there's Morena, which is the National Regeneration Movement. It's actually an acronym, but it's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek name because it actually is also a bit of a wink to the Virgen de Guadalupe, La Morena, but also like the skin color of the Mexican people, you know, kind of generally being, you know, of a darker complexion, right? So there's a lot of it there that kind of speaks to, you know, the base that does make up Morena. And it's a left-wing party, you know, ideologically, they call it Mexican humanism, but it's very much kind of a nationalist, developmentalist agenda about, you know, a mixed economy with state intervention in largely, you know, free enterprise kind of system. So, you know, categorize as you will. You know, I would say they're, you know, to give a kind of a Western comparison, it's kind of like Mélenchon's group in France. You know, they're to the left of the Labour Party in the UK, left of the NDP in Canada, to give an example. And then there's the opposition bloc. So curiously, here in Mexico, despite the fact that these are nominally independent parties, they've actually been operating as a group due to the influence of a oligarch by the name of Claudio X Gonzalez, who thinks he's a political genius. He's actually really bad at it, but he does Morena a favor by giving really bad advice. And he's basically been funneling money to kind of force the opposition to work together. They actually ran as a united coalition with a single candidate in the last elections. So the parties that make that is the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party. That's kind of it's a center-right party today, but it was the party of, that gave stability to Mexico in the post-revolutionary period that governed the country for 70 years. Then there's the National Action Party, which was always kind of the official opposition in the PRI's years. It is a right-wing party. It has far-right elements inside of it. There was an effort to create a further right party, but it failed, and so they've largely stayed inside of the National Action Party. It actually has its roots in Nazism, oddly enough. But it is kind of your, standard, right-wing political party. In this last election, there was a lot of talk about social programs because they're very, very popular. And the opposition coalition had to run saying, oh, we'll defend social programs. But as soon as the election was over, the recently ousted, but at the time, the president of the party said, oh, what a mistake. We've always been opposed to social programs, right? So it speaks to, free markets, integration with the United States, international cooperation and things like that. So those are the political parties. And that leaves also, there's one more, which is kind of like a third way party. It's called Movimiento Ciudadano, Citizens Movement. It kind of sort of presents itself as progressive, especially on social issues, but it's actually a right-wing party. Everywhere it governs on the right in cooperation with the right. It's very kind of an urban party, very centered around, millennials, and this messaging is kind of aimed towards them, millennials and Gen X, and kind of like, progressive, but, socially progressive, socially liberal, but not interested in class struggle or anything of the sort. Around the Supreme Court, you're absolutely right. I didn't talk about what the actual reform did. The big thing around the Supreme Court is that, so previously it was appointed through a process that involved the Congress. And it now will be directly elected, but not just the Supreme Court, but all judges at the federal level. So all the magistrates and all the judges and the Supreme Court ministers. And Meizhu talked about a little bit about the sort of the reasons why. Part of it is also just like, it's a profoundly kind of corrupt is the word institution, right? With family members working in and out of it. But really, the problem is that, all of its rulings were, the rich and the wealthy and the powerful in this country would always find a way to get their cases in front of the judge that's friendly to them. And they would always get the result that they wanted. And so it was hard to say that we actually had an effective working justice system in this country. And this is, yes, an overhaul. I mean, it's extraordinary. No country's really done it. The only precedent would be some states in the United States elect their judges. Bolivia elects its judges. But really at this scale, at this level, it's never been done before. And maybe it'll work. I mean, the thing is, there's really nothing else to compare it to, but it's pretty extraordinary in terms of that. But I do think, I know that most people are kind of used to this notion that, the judicial branch is not an elected branch, only the executive and the legislative is. But why not? Right? I mean, if we're Democrats, if we believe in democracy, and I think one of the big things is also just faith in the masses, which is one of the defining features of López Obradorismo, or, the ideology of Morena and the fourth transformation, which is just a natural, total faith in the masses of actually believing that they'll make the right decisions. And I'm obviously share that sentiment. I think especially when it comes to like the Supreme Court, for example, right? It's not going to be hard to discern who are the people who are actually interested in advancing human rights, defending the Constitution, expanding people's not just political rights, but their economic, social, and cultural rights, and all this kind of stuff. Like, I don't think it's going to be a difficult choice to make. I think the arguments that, it's too complicated is very elitist, and we shouldn't entertain those kinds of arguments, to be honest. And so I'm excited to see how it works, and it could be precedent setting. It could be something that the rest of the world looks like, and look, we were really weary of what was going to happen in Mexico, but it worked out really well. It served to clean up their justice system. Maybe that's what we need elsewhere. I mean, certainly you need a shakeup in the U.S. Supreme Court. That's, I think, pretty obvious to everybody, anybody progressive anyway, or on the left. And gosh, I forgot what was the last bit. So it was the commentary around imperialism and anti-imperialism. So I think one of the key features about The Fourth Transformation of Mexico is precisely, it is an anti-imperialist movement. I mean, the party, its bases have anti-imperialist outlook. You can see some of the courses that they offer in the political school as proof of that. But it is very much the predominant ideology, which is a curious thing for Mexico, being on the border with the United States. There's advantages and there's disadvantages. And to have, the hegemonic power in the world on your border is a pretty intimidating thing. But Mexico has not wavered in its anti-imperialist positions, which is, made me, as somebody who strongly identifies as an anti-imperialist, very proud. There's a couple of cases that I think are worth highlighting. One I always talk about is Venezuela. So there was a coup attempt in Venezuela where they tried to get some random lawmaker to call himself president and have the world recognize them. I always give this example because, as somebody who follows Venezuela very closely, I was watching to see what's Mexico going to do. All morning, we heard country after country that was aligned with Washington saying, nope, we don't recognize Maduro anymore. We recognize this guy. And Mexico, around 11 a.m., issues a statement saying, like, we're not playing along with this. We have relationships with the government of Venezuela, which is headed up by President Maduro. And I think that intervention served to really stop that momentum, and in a lot of ways probably stop that coup from being consolidated in Venezuela. As an example, Mexico sent military jets with diplomatic staff on board to preserve the life of Evo Morales, to go rescue him, who was very much going to be killed had Mexico not done that. And so these are a couple of examples. And then obviously, Mexico's position could be better, but at least we can say that Mexico's taken a position against the genocide that's happening in Palestine, that's being carried out by the Zionist entity. Mexico joined Chile in referring a case not to the World Court but the ICC to prosecute the Israeli government officials for their role in the genocide. Mexico under López Obrador and now with Claudia Sheinbaum officially recognized Palestine as the state and engaged in open diplomatic relations with the state of Palestine. And then we've seen as well, a continuation of that policy. I think the demand here in Mexico is to break diplomatic and economic relations with Israel, which I think is the appropriate demand. But certainly, at least it's amongst the chorus of voices that has been speaking out against, Israel's actions in Palestine and the genocide it's carrying out. And I think that's important given Mexico's place in the international community and its relationship with the United States, right? It's no small thing when OECD, country that shares the continent with the United States is also taking the correct position when it comes to Palestine.
And they've given material support to Cuba right now, and continue to support Cuba in spite of all the pressure not to. They've also spoken out against the Organization of American States under AMLO. He said, let's get rid of that and form one without the United States. And then, so he's been really at the forefront of leading Latin America. I just wanted to say really quickly, because I see Aaron had a question about the nonprofit sector. And Jose, you might know more about the Mexican nonprofit sector, although like in the United States, you can be a nonprofit and be, progressive, but you can also be totally right wing. I mean, some of our biggest nonprofits are right wing ones. So it's not like a unified sector in any way. I would say in terms of international nonprofits, unfortunately, some of them, well-intentioned as they are, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions, as the saying goes, act like U.S. imperialists. They think that they know better. They are the ones who should be telling Mexico how to run things. So even on environmental matters, they have done campaigns that stop this or that, not understanding the total situation of the context. So I think we just need to watch out for international nonprofits too.
Yeah. So very quickly to answer that on the nonprofits, because I saw it in the chat as well. But so it's a bit different from the U.S. If I actually come from the nonprofit sector when I lived in Canada, so I'm somewhat familiar with it. But I think there's also been a qualitative change, I would say, in the last 8 years since I've left the sector. Particularly in the United States, in terms of like the amount of money, right? Like I was surprised when I did the speaking tour that so many of the people that do the political work that used to be volunteer and grassroots is now paid work through NGOs. And there is a very much, you mentioned it in the question, right? The nonprofit industrial complex, which is kind of meant to constrain movements to make them, civil society groups acting in sync with the capitalist mode of production, right? There is a lot of NGOs here. Like I mentioned, the democratic neoliberal period was very much kind of one that was oriented towards building a society, in the style of the United States, Canada, Western Europe, right? To try to build that kind of, organize the way you want to organize society. And part of that involves creating a new professional kind of middle class, creating new study programs in the universities and all this kind of stuff. And so it was effective in the sense that so much of the nonprofit sector, and it's something I've been looking at more recently, it's mostly staffed by people from middle class sectors, privileged sectors, wealthy sectors, people who went to private universities and things like that. And so while I have progressive social ideas, they have no class analysis. They're very much divorced, deliberately so, right? Like that's what these schools taught them. This idea that civil society and shared prosperity and all this kind of stuff. And so, interestingly, many of the NGOs, some of them are foreign funded, and I echo Meizhu's concerns around foreign intervention via NGOs. That is very, very much an issue. But the ones based here in Mexico City are very adversarial on the question, for example, of the judicial reform. It's an organization that I have respect for. They've done very, very important work. It's called the Centro de Derechos Humanos Pro Agustín Juárez. Centro Pro is the short way of calling it. They are totally opposed to judicial reform. And I think they take that position precisely because the despectivo, the mean term we use in Spanish is progres buenonditas, like well-intentioned progressives, right? Sort of, this cadre of people in these institutions. I think, for example, the Centro Pro taking a position opposed to judicial reform, the new constitution, because it's not really a reform anymore, is one that's driven by the same kind of these blinders that they have around class issues. They'll say like, oh, this could represent a danger to the advancement of human rights. So I studied human rights at the Autonomous University of Mexico City. I didn't mention that in my intro, but so I'm familiar with the discourse around human rights and the way that it's evolved over time and things like that. And I think one of the key things that I remember that if I was in conversation with the people of this NGO, for example, is that, human rights are progressive, they're indivisible, and they're interdependent. So if you oppose the efforts by admittedly political efforts to transform, the old elements of the old regime, like the Supreme Court, like the electoral authority, like the media, and if you reject that, you're actually you're actually slowing down the advancement of human rights in their complete sense, right? Because it's under the Morena governments where we've seen an expansion of actually following through on the commitments around human rights that the Constitution actually spells out, which is like education, housing, healthcare, around access to culture, around having a dignified life, around employment rights, all these kinds of things. They've only been able to advance as a result of the political struggle against the old conservative regime. And so even though you can dislike this or that feature of the new constitution of the judicial reform, if you oppose it wholesale, you're actually opposing the advancement of human rights. And they're able to reach these kinds of conclusions precisely for what I said at the beginning, is that they don't have that class analysis. They don't understand that this is a class struggle, that there are enemies, right? There's a reason why I mentioned this guy earlier, Claudio X. Gonzalez. He's created all kinds of civil society groups, Unidos, the Frente Cívico Nacional, all kinds of groups that are excuses to present yourself as civil society, but you're actually conservative forces, political forces representing the old regime, a return to neoliberalism. And so anyway, it is a battle because we have to change that. We have to have, progressives who are educated, who can fill these roles, but who also have class struggle and class analysis at the center of their work. We're not there yet, but it takes time, but I think we can get there.
So I think we've taken up a lot of your time. So I don't know, Elena, we just really thank you for your interest and your, your questions and your discussion here. Elena, did you want to, yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Faintly.
I don't know why you can't hear me. I'm sorry. I want to thank you also for giving us this really broad perspective of the elections and the moment in Mexico. The question that I had, you touched on it a tiny bit, just passing through the history of Morena, is the political school. So that, and I know that many of us are questioning how to do political education in the moment that we're in, and we do it in a really really grassroots way here because that's all we have. But it's also, I wanted to mention that for the last couple of years, I tune in every morning to Facebook Live to see the president of Mexico, because it was a bright spot in the darkness that we've been living here. And listening to him every day and having these conversations in all these different places all around the country and discussing things, it really sounded to me like I was listening to a liberation theologian and talking to people in ways that put the experiences of people on the ground in high relief compared to listening to politicians. And I was wondering about the transition between AMLO and who the next person would be, and how strong the ideals of the party would be versus a personality. And I just watching this and listening to, you can tell that they're very different people. But if people could tune in every day and see the thousands of people on Facebook Live, saludos de parte de Detroit, wherever, and greeting the president and listening to him, because it was so uplifting, not in any way painting over the situation, but grappling with it, truly grappling with it, and talking to people like they had the intelligence to have this conversation. That's what I wanted to, that's one of the reasons that I wanted to share this discussion with the group. And I really am happy that people came to it. Chicanos have not been able to really engage with Mexican politics all the way here on the northern border, but it's just something that I wanted to have a continuing conversation with you on.
Yeah, hopefully this is the start of a longer relationship. I mean, that's one of the things that we've always been trying to do, is really kind of not be sectarian whatsoever with who we work with and who we don't and all that. We did the speaking tour, I've mentioned it before, but we did that with folks from the Communist Party. There are people from DSA, there are people from Liberation Road. So I think it's important, whoever's willing to listen. I'll share a little bit of it. I can't say too much yet, but I'm actively working on something to help bring more about Mexican politics to a US audience with some friends over at the public television station here. So hopefully we'll have news for that. If it does, I'll share it with you and you can share with everybody else. But there is now, I think, a better understanding about the importance of Mexicans in the US, Mexican Americans, Chicanos, and the need to do deliberate political outreach to them. So hopefully we'll be able to do more, and precisely to inspire people. I'll try to very briefly respond to the question around political education. There's a lot of emphasis on political education from Morena. There a lot of money and energy is spent on it, really pushing to raise the political level of its candidates, of its representatives, of the party leadership, but also the rank and file. Right? Like they use technology to house, every night there's at least something on the YouTube channel for the political school around any given topic, right? With really good instructors and all this stuff. But also the school is physically located here in Mexico City, where they actually have in-person classes as well. So the emphasis on it is obviously really important. It helps that they have the resources of the party. Political parties are publicly funded in Mexico, which helps keep out the corporate influence. And they very generously funded. So there's a lot of money to be able to do it. But before Morena was a party, like I said, it was just all volunteer labor, and the emphasis on political education was there back then as well. And one final thing is that, yeah, I mean, there was a lot of worry about what the transition was going to look like. Was she going to be able to command the same kind of authority? Not being the same figure that López Obrador was. López Obrador promised to disappear from public light, and he has very much so. It's not like, but in that transition period, they were always together. They campaigned together. Sorry, they didn't campaign together. That's banned, but they would go and promote and unveil the new public works that were just finished and things like that together. On the campaign trail, it was interesting to see Claudia at the beginning and at the end. She definitely got better at it, and she's very good at it now, right? Even, she has her own touch, which is always nice. I think it's also helpful. Kind of renewing the leadership in that sense. But you can watch the Mañanera still. It's shorter now. It used to be like 2 to 3 hours, and now it's about an hour and a half. So again, it's her own style and her ways. There's even jokes here amongst those of us who work in media. It goes basically under Claudia Sheinbaum, how was your breakfast? And she answers, it was very good. Next question. And if you had asked López Obrador, he would have said, oh, I had some eggs with some tomatoes that I picked personally from a garden. And it reminds me of this time, it's a very different style. As a journalist, I'm a little more grateful for the shorter one because it's easier to kind of watch on fast forward and catch up. But I will say that challenge of kind of handing over the leadership was successfully carried out. I think it was very, very well done. It was very deliberately done. Quite literally, there was we call it bastón de mando. It's a bit of a tradition among some indigenous communities here in Mexico, which is literally like a stick with like some decorated, and he was given one and he passed it on to her. And I think it was very much kind of a very symbolic, but also very important one.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. And then also, there was a image that went viral, which is when she went to go visit the military academy, right? Which kind of ties into an earlier question. We never had a female president in Mexico. Was she going to be able to kind of command authority over the armed forces? And we saw them definitely transmit the sense of authority, that they respect her authority and that she occupies that role, right? She's the commander in chief of the armed forces of Mexico. It's a woman. And I guess that's a good note to end on, which is that, we shouldn't fall into the trap of just, blindly celebrating identity, the fact that a woman was elected. But I do think it's pretty significant because it's this woman, because it's a woman who came from organizing clandestinely as a student, who used to visit political prisoners in jail along with her parents, who was a very active member of the student movement, who was participating in the fight against privatization, fighting for public education, always involved in environmental causes, very, very well educated, comes from a religious minority group, a tiny religious minorities group. She's a Jewish woman in a very Catholic country. I saw some of the takes in the following the elections, like, oh, the U.S. is never going to elect a black woman. You can't really compare the two countries, but if Mexico can elect a Jewish woman, I'm pretty sure the U.S. could have elected a black woman too. I think there were other factors at play, but Mexico didn't elect a right-wing Jewish woman; it elected a left-wing Jewish woman, and someone who's done a really, really good job. And it's funny. Before he left, López Obrador said, "Boy, if you think I was a thorn in your side, I'm a bougie compared to Claudia Sheinbaum. Just wait." And it's true. She's, in her own way, in her own style, she's really kind of taken more of a fighting stance against her rivals. And it's nice to see. It's nice to see her use the majority, the supermajority they have, to take on these adversaries and to continue to move forward, to press forward that agenda. Because I think if she had wavered, they would have seen that as a weakness and would have doubled up their attacks. There's still a lot of risks. There's still a lot more challenges ahead for Mexico. I think there's a pretty significant risk from the Trump administration in terms of some of the ideas that they've been talking about, but also, following what she said, right? Like, Mexico is a proud nation, it was a proud people, and we're going to confront the bilateral relationship as we will, because as we have to in the interests of Mexico. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. We're going to finish now. I think this has been recorded, and people who can see it at a later date. And this definitely will not be our last conversation. Thank you.